Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Well, Candy and I are absolutely delighted to be back in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, a place where people have common sense. And, you know, when I first came to HUD, a senior government official came to me and said, "You're going to have to stop all this God stuff." And I basically told him to go jump in the lake. Because isn't it the God stuff that made us into a great nation? You know, our founding document says our rights come from God, not from the government. And it has been our grasp of that concept and the fact that we trusted in God that led us from a ragtag group of militiamen to the pinnacle of the world in record time. That was no coincidence. That was because we had a relationship with God and we had values and principles. And I'm going to talk about some very serious things today that God has put on my heart. But let's just have a word of prayer. Kind Father in heaven, we thank you for an opportunity to gather ourselves together in your house of worship. And we ask that your Spirit would guide us. Let the words that are spoken be yours and not mine. And let our hearts be prepared to receive them. In Jesus' name, amen. You know, there's so many things that are going on in our society right now that are not pleasing in the sight of God. And God has given us directions. He's given us His Word. And it's not because He's dictatorial. It's because He loves us. He gives us instructions because He made us. Have you ever gone and bought a complex piece of equipment? Notice that it comes with instructions. You know, now some people don't look at them, you know. They say, if all else fails, read the instructions. But, you know, the fact of the matter is He has told us how to live our lives because He wants us to get the most out of them, not because He's dictatorial. And He loves us so much that He sent His only begotten Son to die for our sins. And a lot of people have an impression of God as an exacting, dictatorial, judgmental individual who's watching everything that you do and writing it down to make sure that you pay for whatever things that you have done. That's not God. That's the other guy. God wants to save you. And I believe that if you would be happy living with God forever, that He will find a way to save you. If you would not be happy, why would He put you in that situation? That would be torture. So I don't think that we should ever think of God as looking to exclude us. We should be looking at Him as someone who's trying to include us. Well, one of the troubling things that's going on in our society today is unfairness. And I was reading an article a couple of weeks ago about an event, a women's cycling event. And the person who came in first was a transgender woman, a man who saw himself as a woman. The real women who came in second and third refused to stand on the winner's stage with him because they said, this is unfair, you know? And this kind of thing is just going on all over our society. When I was at HUD, I had many contentious hearings because some of the congressmen on the left thought that we should be opening up the federally supported women's shelters to transgender men. Now, many of the women, if not most of the women who were in there because men were problems in their lives and were abusing them. The last thing they needed to see was a man in their shelter that they had come away from. And, I tried to explain this to some of the Congress people, and they just didn't seem to be able to get it, or I don't think they wanted to get it. They said, we think that these people should be able to be in there, no matter what they look like, because they feel that they're a woman. Well, when did your feelings trump your biology? When did that happen? And interestingly enough, the Bible has plenty to say about some of the sexual perversions that are going on in our society. You look at the first chapter of Romans. I think you come away with that with no question in your mind about what God thought. And you look at Leviticus 18 and see what the Lord said about those things also. But I'll tell you what's interesting. A lot of people say that this is of recent origin, that we were doing just fine until just recently. But this has been going on for a long time. And if you look at the congressional record from January the 10th, 1963, read into that record were the 45 goals of the Communist Party. I'm not going to read all 45 of them, but just give you a flavor. Goal number 15, capture one or both of the political parties in the United States. One of them's been captured already. Number 17, get control of the schools. Use them as transmission belts for socialism and current communist propaganda. Soften the curriculum, get control of teachers' associations, put the party line in textbooks. Then number 20 and 21, infiltrate the press. Get control of book review assignments, editorial writing, policy-making positions. Gain control of key positions in radio, TV, and motion pictures. 24 to 26, eliminate all laws governing obscenity by calling them censorship and a violation of free speech and free press. Break down cultural standards of morality by promoting pornography and obscenity in books, magazines, motion pictures, radio, and TV. Present homosexuality, degeneracy, and promiscuity as normal, natural, healthy. Number 35, discredit and eventually dismantle the FBI. Number 40 and 41, discredit the family as an institution. Encourage promiscuity and easy divorce. Emphasize the need to raise children away from the negative influence of parents. Attribute prejudice, mental blocks, and retarding of children to suppressive influence of parents. Does any of that sound like stuff that's going on? It's pretty amazing how effective they've been because, Khrushchev said 60 years ago that your grandchildren's children will live under communism and we won't have to fire one shot. They won't have to fire a shot because they planted all of these things in our society, and they know how to corrupt society and to corrupt people and to break up our relationships and to remove God. And they've been doing a very effective job, but they haven't completed the job, and we have time to stop it. But we have to know what's going on. And it means that we can't be afraid. See, their chief weapon is intimidation, and make you afraid to speak up, make you just stand in the corner, stare at your shoes, and hope no one calls you a nasty name, that no one tries to cancel you, that no one interferes with your family. But I got to tell you, no matter what they do to you, how long can they do it compared to the backdrop of eternity? And that's what we should be looking at, eternity and our life with our Savior forever, and not the temporary pleasures of this earth and what's going on here. However, I will tell you also that it gives you a sense of peace when you're not afraid. You know, what did God say? What in 2 Timothy 1:7? God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love, which gives us the ability to face these things without worrying about them. You know, there's so many things that happen in our lives that make us fearful. But we should look at the things that God has done. Sometimes we don't think about them, that protects us. I remember when I was a senior in college, and I had met a young lady who was also from Detroit. And the school, Yale, said if you would go home and recruit for them on Thanksgiving, they would pay your way. Well, we were both from poor families, so this was a great opportunity to be able to go home for Thanksgiving on the school's credit card. So this was cool. And we got to go out to restaurants and all kinds of things. But the last night before we were supposed to go back to New Haven, we were in Temperate, visiting some of our friends at the University of Michigan. And we had to drive all night to get the car back in time, the car that had been rented. And on Interstate 80, right around Youngstown, Ohio, we both fell asleep. The car was going 90 miles an hour. Awakened by the rambling of the car as it was going off the road, heading toward a ravine. I grabbed the wheel and turned it, and instead of the car flipping over and going down into the ravine, it started spinning like a spinning top. They say your life flashes before you in a newsreel just before you die. It did. I saw the newsreel. It was pretty cool. And then the car just stopped on the lane next to the shoulder, just in time to pull off before an 18-wheeler came barreling through. By that time, we were both awake. And, you know, we said, you know what? The Lord spared our lives for a reason. He wants us to do something. That was the night we started going together, and we've now been married for 48 years. My wife, Candy Carson. But we don't worry so much anymore. We never talk about having adventures, though, because before that trip, we had talked about the fact that there wasn't a lot of adventure in life. We never mention that anymore. But he's given us a lot of adventures over the years, but the way that God takes care of you should alleviate all fear. You know, a few years back, I was speaking at an event in Alaska, and I got there a little early. So the sponsor said, "Would you like to see the glaciers in Glacier Valley?" I said, "Yeah, that would be cool." So I get in this plane, just me and a pilot, single engine plane, up over the mountains and down into Glacier Valley. It was surreal. It was like you were on a different planet. And then all of a sudden, heavy cloud cover came in. Now this plane only flew by sight. It did not fly by instruments. So the pilot said, "We're in trouble." Well, I knew that already. And he said, "I can't see anything, but I'm going to climb as fast as possible without going into a stall. And hopefully we won't hit the mountain." And we're climbing through the clouds, and of course I'm praying. And finally we break cloud cover, and I could see that we missed the top of the mountain by 3 feet. But you know what? I'm not supposed to die in an airplane, because there was another circumstance where we were in the Bahamas, and I was speaking, and then the people in another part of the Bahamas in Nassau heard I was on the island. They said, "Oh, you got to come and speak to us." So they sent this twin-engine airplane, and we're about 10 miles from the shore when one of the engines went out. And all of a sudden, instead of flying like this, the plane was flying like this. And the pilot was grappling at things, and he turned around and he said, "We're in trouble." Well, once again, I knew that already. And I had already gone deep into prayer. And the pilot could not get the nose of the plane to angle downward. And he said, as we approached the runway where I could see all the fire engines were out with their lights flashing, expecting a crash landing, he said, "I can't get the nose to go down, so I'm going to cut power, and the plane will go into a dive. And then before we hit ground, I'm going to power up, and it'll come back up much faster than normal because it's listing upward." I said, "Have you ever done that before?" He said, "Nope." But obviously it worked because I'm here. And 50 yards onto the runway, the other engine went dead. So I'm not supposed to die in an airplane. And so if you're afraid to fly, fly with me. But the point being that God takes care of us. I could tell you some other horrifying stories too, but I'm not going to do it because you wouldn't want to fly. But when I was a resident, we had a 2-year period in the laboratory where you could accomplish some significant research project. And my job was to create an animal brain tumor model that we could experiment on. And the only thing that would consistently grow in a rabbit's brain was something we call VX2 carcinoma. It grows in virtually anything. So, unfortunately, during one of the experiments, I was accidentally injected with the VX2 carcinoma in my finger. And, we told the oncologist, and they monitored me, and something started growing at the injection site. And then something started growing in my throat. It was spreading. And the oncologist had no idea what to do. And my wife and I were reading in a book called Back to Eden about natural remedies for cancer and red clover tea. So she made all this red clover tea, and I was drinking gallons of red clover tea every day. And the tumors disappeared. So The Lord has a way of taking care of you. And then I remember I was going to the hospital, and I was 1 block away from the hospital, and somebody ran a red light going 60 miles an hour, completely demolished my car. I was knocked out for a moment. When I awakened, there were lights all around, the ambulance, police. And I was saying, I got cases to do. I got to get to the hospital. They said, no, you need to go to the emergency room. I said, I don't need to go. I'm a doctor. I'm okay. A few little scrapes and bruises, nothing. Because I had 3 cases I had to do. So the police took me to the hospital. My phone had been destroyed in the accident. So one of the police officers gave me his cell phone. He says, we know you. You're worth our trust, so just take my phone and use it. And I was able to go to the hospital and complete my operations. Never was able to drive that car again. It was totaled. But this is the way the Lord protects you. And you never have to worry. So why have a spirit of fear? Why be worried about anything when you know that He has everything under control? What a difference that makes. And also in terms of what you do. When I entered government, I'd never had government experience. But the one thing that was very clear to me at HUD is that the finances were in horrible shape. They had not had an audit, which is required by law every year for 8 years. You couldn't do an audit because there were so many material defects. The whole place was in shambles. That's why I used to always hear all these stories about fiscal mismanagement and billions of dollars disappearing at HUD. Well, of course, I was very alarmed about that. And we managed to find an individual who was a senior accountant at Ernst & Young, 37 years of experience. And with a lot of arm twisting, we convinced him to come to HUD. He didn't want to come. And when he looked at the books there, he was horrified. He said, Ernst & Young would have never taken you on as a client. But he put together a team and was able to turn that entire agency around. In fact, he wrote a book called Transformation of a Federal Agency, which is used in a lot of colleges now. HUD is probably the best run federal agency in Washington now because of that. And once that was done, it made it possible for us to be able to do a whole host of other things that you couldn't do when you had books that were so messed up. So, for instance, the Envision Centers. Now that came from Proverbs 29:18 that says, without a vision, the people perish. And there were a lot of people around the country who were perishing. And we were very alarmed about that. So we put together a program in which 13 federal agencies, working with state agencies, local agencies, nonprofits, faith-based organizations, would all be under one roof in the various communities, so that that mother who had never finished high school and had 3 little kids could go to one place and get child care and get registered in a GED program, and finishing that could get advanced training so that she could become financially independent and begin to teach that to her children, because that's the only way you break chronic poverty. You have to break it at that level. And then there were programs like FYI, Foster Youth to Independence. Some youth from Ohio had come to us to tell us about how horrible their lives were when they aged out of foster care. And, many of them ended up in drug trafficking and sexual trafficking, and many of them were homeless. And their stories were so compelling that our staff at HUD was so impressed that within 4 months, we had put together the Foster Youth to Independence program, where we would give them vouchers for housing and wraparound services. Because an 18-year-old, even if you have a place to live, if you don't have a support system, you're probably still going to have a very difficult time. You can imagine if you were 18 and didn't have a family, didn't have a support system. So that made a tremendous difference, and that program continues to grow. And then we had the mustard seed program, from Matthew 13, faith the size of a mustard seed, smooth mountain. Well, remembering who took care of the homeless and the needy and the poor before we had such big invasive government? Churches did. They were already right there in the communities. So we said, rather than imposing a bunch of government programs, why don't we work with the churches and let them create the programs and then support them and what they're doing without putting a whole bunch of strings onto it. And some of the churches really grasp that, start using some of their excess properties to build homes on that they would put homeless families into, and then use the resources of the church to get those people back on their feet, because the churches had members who could do almost anything, whatever was needed for that family. That's the kind of thing that really works. And of course you have a lot of opposition from those who want to keep people dependent, who want to be able to control people. And that's still going on today, believe me. And we've got a lot of work to do. But I do believe that we, the people, have the ability to fix all of those things, particularly with God in charge. And then we have the opportunity zones, in which all the governors of every state were able to designate the areas of their states that were most needy, and were able to concentrate some of the federal resources in those areas to build those areas up. And that was a very effective program as well. Those are the kinds of things that I think government should be doing. And we should be finding ways to unite people. This is called the United States of America. But look how divided we are right now. It's the divided states of America. And I'm thinking back to 1967 in Detroit. We had incredible riots in Detroit in 1967. You can actually still see the scars of it today, more than 50 years later. Tanks rumbling down the street, buildings on fire, people being shot. It was really a terribly destructive time in the history of our country and in the history of Detroit. 1967. 1 year later, 1968, there was so much harmony and goodwill in Detroit because in 1968, the Detroit Tigers won the World Series. They were an amazing team. It was the last time a team had a 30-game winner, Denny McClain. And every night there was a different hero. And I remember we were so excited about that. But what did it show? It shows that when people have something in common that they cheer for, it brings them together. And that's what we have to start looking for in this country. What are the things that we have in common that will make the difference for us? And when it doesn't matter who gets the credit also, when you just have goals that you put out without worrying about who's going to get the credit. That's what we see that's going on in our society right now. All these politicians, I. You know, what about we? What about us? This is what we have to begin to concentrate on. I remember one case of conjoined twins. Conjoined twins have always fascinated people. You know, go back to the original Siamese twins, Chang and Ing Bunker, who were born in Siam, which of course is called Thailand now. They were joined at the chest and at the liver. And they came to this country when they were 18 years old, made Barnum and Bailey famous, traveled all over. Everybody knew about the Siamese twins. And they were very interesting fellows. They were quite well educated. And they even got married to two different women. Their wives were twin sisters, but their wives couldn't stand each other. So they had to live with one wife one week and the other wife the next week. And between them, they had 21 children. No pun intended. So it was pretty amazing, you know, the life that they lived, and people have always been fascinated with conjoined twins. But there was one case, we had done a number of them by that time, and they were from Europe. And I said, why should I be the one who does this whole operation when we have the #1 neurosurgery department in the country with incredible experts in all kinds of areas, skull base, tissue separation, vascular. We had all these different subspecialties in neurosurgery. So I got a whole bunch of my colleagues involved. We had 18 neurosurgeons, and we would divide them up in teams to do the part of the operation where they were the world expert. We were literally 10 hours ahead of schedule of where it would have been if I was the one who was doing the operation. And that is the kind of thing that we have to start concentrating on in this country. We have a lot of people who are very good at a lot of things. And if we allow those people to do those things that they're good at and work together and not spend a lot of time trying to figure out who gets the credit, can you imagine what the impact of that will be? And that's what good leadership does. Good leadership is able to get people with different talents working together. Good leaders don't necessarily know everything, but they know what needs to be known, and they know what needs to be done and how to coordinate that. And that's what we need to be looking for in leaders that we have. We also need to recognize that in this country, God has blessed us tremendously with diversity. Diversity is actually a good thing. Can you imagine how boring things would be if everybody looked exactly like you? Think about that. Well, you think about some segments of our society which are not thriving. You've all heard it said that the black male in American society is an endangered species. Why did they say that? Because there are so many who are involved with the penal system. Homicide is the #1 reason for death amongst that group. What is going on? What can be done about it? Well, what if we took that little black boy who's 6 years old by the hand and you walked him down the streets of Nashville? You could give him a black history lesson that he would never forget. You could start out by pointing to his shoes and saying it was John Matzliger, a black man, who invented the automatic shoe lasting machine, which revolutionized the shoe industry throughout the world. And you step on that clean street, Charles Brooks, a black man, invented the street sweeper, those machines with the big brushes. And down that street comes a big refrigerated tractor-trailer truck. It was Frederick Jones who invented the refrigeration system for trucks, later adopted for airplanes, and boats, and trains. And it comes to a stop at the red light. You can tell it was Garrett Morgan, a black man who invented the traffic signal. And while you're talking about him, how he invented the gas mask, saved lots of lives during the war. And while you're talking about the war, Henrietta Bradbury, a black woman who invented the underwater cannon, made it possible to launch torpedoes from submarines. And you see a beautiful black woman walking down the street. A black man did not invent her, but you can use that opportunity to talk about Madam C.J. Walker, a black woman who invented cosmetic products for women of dark complexion, who became the first female millionaires on her own efforts in this country. And then you walk past the hospital, Charles Drew, his contributions to blood banking, understanding the function of blood plasma. Daniel Hale Williams, the first successful open heart surgery in the world, had an operative mortality rate less than 1.5%. You look up at the surgical light, Thomas Edison. You didn't know he was black, did you? Well, he wasn't. But his right-hand man, Lewis Latimer, was. And you can tell how Lewis Latimer came up with the filament that made the light bulb work for more than 2 or 3 days, invented the electric lamp, diagrammed the telephone for Alexander Graham Bell, was a tremendous inventor in his own right. Most people never heard of him. We walked past the railroad tracks. Andrew Beard, the automatic railroad car coupler, spurred on the Industrial Revolution. Elijah McCoy, automatic lubrication system for locomotive engines. In fact, Elijah McCoy had so many great inventions, and they were so good, people were always trying to copy them. And people would say, is that a McCoy? Is that the real McCoy? You got people like David Duke talking about the real McCoy, don't even know who he's paying homage to. And, and I'm barely scratching the surface. But here's what's really cool about America. I could take that same walk down the street for virtually any ethnicity and point out tremendous contributions. And that's why I say our diversity is not a problem. It is a blessing from God. And if we learn how to look at things not as enemies, not as one in this corner and one in the other corner, imagine how effective we could be. You take something like energy. You got a whole bunch of people in this corner, Green New Deal, the world's going to end, all this stuff. People in this corner, we got all this wonderful fossil fuels, and we're blessed with that, and never the twain should meet. Well, does that make any sense? Makes no sense at all. Why do they have to be mutually exclusive? Why can't we use what we have effectively without creating a lot of hardships for our people by elevating the energy costs so that it alters the way that they do things? We can use what we have to get what we want. And that's what smart people do. Stupid people just get over in their relative corners and shoot hand grenades at each other. We need the right kind of leaders to help us to realize that we don't have to be in opposite corners. We can use all these things together for the benefit of everybody. And then you look at something like the border, which is a real problem, our southern border, no question about it. But why don't we act like intelligent people? Is a wall a good thing? Is it effective? Yes, walls have been used for thousands of years. They have been extremely effective. And of course, you should have a wall. But you should also recognize that we need population and we need certain people to do things. So why wouldn't it be smarter to finish the wall, have a secure border, and have a robust guest worker program? As long as people were doing things the right way and they were registered, They could come, they could work, they could pay taxes, come and go as they please. And if they wanted to become an American citizen, they have to do the same thing that anybody else does who wants to be an American citizen. And, that would be so much easier. I think a lot of our Congress people realize that. Why won't they do something that makes sense like that? It's too juicy a political issue. They want to milk it for everything it's worth rather than do what's effective for our society. It's we the people who are going to have to put the pressure on them to get them to do the kinds of thing. But the most important thing is to recognize that we don't have to fret because we have a God who is in charge. And we've read the last chapter, and we know how things come out here. And it doesn't have to affect how we feel. I remember there was a case of a family. They were trying to have a child. They had tried for a long time. It just was not working out. And finally, the Lord blessed them with a child. But it turns out that the child's skull wasn't growing. The child was about 5 months old. The pediatrician was very concerned. Scans showed pressure marks. The child was having some developmental issues. So we decided we had to do an operation to expand the skull. And, these are things that we commonly did, so it was no big deal. But during the operation, the child went into cardiac arrest. And the anesthesiologists were doing CPR. And after about 10 minutes, we still didn't have a complex. And they said, I think we should call. Unfortunately, we're not going to be able to save this child. And I said, keep going, because I haven't finished praying yet. And after about 2 more minutes, patient developed a heartbeat. But that's not even close to the end of the story. After the operation was completed, the child was fixed and dilated. No evidence of brain function at all. And, the parents were strong Christians, and the father and I challenged each other to see who could pray the hardest. But unfortunately, in the ICU, things looked pretty grim. But just before a day had passed, the pupils started working. And the brain function started being apparent once again. And everybody in the hospital was talking about this kid who had revived. And how in the world could this happen? But before the joy could be extended, the child started having pulmonary problems. And the pulmonary specialist said only 5% of the lung was working, and that was about to give out too, and that the child was going to die from a pulmonary death. And we were devastated. I was scheduled to go to Ohio the next day to speak at one of the medical schools there. And just before I was going to go, I was going to go back to the hospital because I figured the child would be dead or close to dead by then. I wanted to try to comfort the parents. But then my youngest son had a severe asthma attack at that point. And the ambulance came to get him, and by the time that was done, I didn't have time to go to the hospital, so I had to go straight to the airport. But I called the ICU as soon as I got there, hoping that the parents were still there. I could at least talk to them on the phone. And the nurse said, the lungs are working again. They have returned to function. It was just another amazing thing that happened in this child. And when I got back, I had to go to California because I was involved in a study group with NIH. We were doing some reviews. And while I was gone, the neurologist had come. because the child was to be assessed to see if there was a candidate for rehabilitation because of all the injury that the child had suffered. And the neurologist said that the child would not be a candidate for rehab because the child would not be able to see, would not be able to hear, and would be barely functioning above a vegetative level. So when I got back from California after a lot of prayer, I walked into that child's room, and the child clearly looked at me. And the child could clearly hear, and the child went home perfectly normal. So the neurologists were correct. The child was not a candidate for rehab because the child didn't need rehab. So, you know, when you're seeing things like that, you don't doubt God. You know, a lot of times we look at the Bible and we say, you know, he did all these miracles back in those times. But, you know, the same God is here now. And in Malachi 3:6 it says, I am God and I change not. He doesn't change. What he has said in the past still applies today. But I'll tell you something interesting. God does have a sense of humor. Because you remember the last time I was here, I talked about my temper. And it was, you know, a horrendous temper. And I started reading from the book of Proverbs. Well, the book of Proverbs was written by Solomon. And my middle name happens to be Solomon. So he knew that I was going to have this affinity for the book of Solomon. And when Solomon became the king of Israel, what was the first thing that he did that brought him great fame? 2 women came to him claiming to be the mother of the same baby. What did he advocate? Divide the babies. Well, that's when I became very well known, when I divided babies too. So I can tell you, he has a sense of humor. He really does. And, you know, he is really a nice guy. But I think what he wants us to know is that we must trust him, and we must not faint for fear. We must be people of courage. And where does courage come from? It comes from our faith in him. You know, when I was a resident, I was on call one night, and it was a time of a national neurosurgical meeting, so all the attendings were away at this meeting, except for the one that had been left behind to deal with any emergencies that came up. And a young man was brought into the emergency room who had been severely beaten with a baseball bat. And he was unconscious. His brain was swelling. The CAT scan showed hemorrhagic areas of his brain. And the only way to save him was to do a dramatic operation in which you remove part of the frontal lobe and part of the temporal lobe to make room. It's an operation I'd seen before, but not one I ever done before. But I couldn't do it anyway because I was a resident. So I called for the attending who had been left behind and couldn't reach him. And the nurses called for him, couldn't reach him. And the paging operator called for him, couldn't reach him. Nobody could reach him. And this young man was dying. And I was by myself, and I couldn't do the operation legally. I didn't know what to do, and I just prayed, and I said, Lord, should I risk my career and take him to the operating room to do an operation I'd never done before? Or should I do the safe thing, intubate him, put him in the intensive care unit, give him steroids, and let nature take its course? And after I prayed that prayer, I immediately knew what to do. I immediately knew that I had to take him to the operating room. And a calm came over me, and I went into the operating room with him. Everything came back to me, everything that I'd seen before. Was able to do the operation. It was successful. Today, that young man is a child psychologist, is doing very well. But I never got into any trouble. In fact, I was praised for having done the right thing. And God will give us the courage to always do the right thing. And we have to be willing to fully trust him. You know, we live in a country today that is trying to push God out. And as we allow that, we are becoming fearful, we are becoming divided, and we are heading downward. We're spiraling downward very quickly. We can reverse that, but it's going to require faith in God. It's going to require courage. And we have to remember, when we sing our national anthem, when we get to the end of that first stanza, and it says, the land of the free and the home of the brave, just remember, you cannot be the land of the free if you're not the home of the brave. Thank you.